Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small, and we train engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building. And if you want to create change in your community in 2023, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel daunting. And that's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. They're here to help you when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates planning. As Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the knowledge and the national network with the experience that you can count on. And to find out more, simply go to their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. And today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment in a campaign matters, so you need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up-to-date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community both online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, just go to their website, which is swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that drops every Friday morning, that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And today we're going to be speaking to John Armitage from QDOS Research. We had John on the podcast maybe 2 months ago with Dr. Andrea Carson from La Trobe University, and we were back then talking about a whole bunch of different things, but in particular we're talking about the Yes referendum. I got John back on the show today to talk about that particular referendum. We're taping this one on a Tuesday, and I think this Thursday coming, so by the time you've listened to it, it's already happened, we're going to get the date of the actual referendum, and all rumours point to the 14th of October. So we're getting closer and closer to the actual referendum date, so we thought we'd get John back on the show to talk a bit about what he has seen since he was last on the show, and get our minds set for the final 7 weeks of the campaign. With that, we're also going to have more guests on the show as we get closer and closer to the referendum vote. So please be on the lookout for those episodes as we just want to sort of build that momentum. And obviously this is a pro-yes podcast, and we just want to ensure everyone out there enrolls to vote. And once you've done that, go and volunteer your time to speak to your neighbours about why they need to vote yes in this historically important referendum. Okay, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to give us 5 stars on the Apple Podcast app. And when you're done listening to the episode, give us a review. And for all the updates, don't forget to follow us at Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All right, let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Tuesday lunchtime on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. Great to be back home after a week up in Brisbane for the ALP National Conference. Joining me on the podcast today is a good friend of mine. He's been on the show before. Glad to get him back again. He's from QDOS Research. John Armitage, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Glad to be here, mate.
We're going to talk about the referendum, the Yes referendum, mostly, but I did run into you at the ALP Fringe, and I just kind of wanted to get your reflections on the ALP conference, starting with the conference itself. It seemed like a pretty boring conference, and if I could put my old Labor Party official hat on, who's been involved in both national and state conferences, we like boring conferences. We don't want conferences where it's going to all the wrong reasons get on the front page of the papers or the 6 o'clock news. But I guess if you're an activist, you kind of want a bit of biff. What were your takeaways from what we saw on the conference floor over the 3 days?
Yeah, I mean, boring in the good way, I think, is a good description, Stephen. I know, and that does sound a bit of a cop-out, doesn't it? Because you'd love to have this idea of this sort of invigorating debate within a political party where you can sort of decide what's important as your platform, but in practice, they're such public events that they effectively become quite stage managed. And the real tension point that could have come up was AUKUS, and I think it did, and there was a really good and healthy debate about that. But it was just classic modern Labor Party at its professional best, I think, managing those conversations in a sensible and respectful way. Some people with genuinely passionate views, but managing to do so in a way that wasn't inflammatory. And I think that I really love the idea of the fringe events around a Labor conference, because this is really about, instead of it just being about Labor Party people all getting our heads together and talking about what matters to us, it's about bringing in, NGOs, and in some cases even, different sort of industry groups and whatever that can sort of participate on the sidelines. And I think that's great. The only thing that sort of struck me physically compared to, I think the last conference I went to was also in Brisbane. I don't know how long that days before. I may have been a delegate and thought it was going to be more exciting than it was. In those days was disappointed that it was boring. But the thing that really struck me was the modern era, the security means that there's there's a lovely building, the convention centre, so many of these wonderful stairs, and it's such a lovely place to be outdoors in winter in Brisbane. And sort of walk up these great stairs, these great glass doors, you can all sort of flow in and out freely. But of course, all sort of cyclone fenced off, and security everywhere, which I guess is just necessary in the modern era. But in some ways, it sort of physically detracted from the warmth that you would otherwise get. But look, I thought, credit to officials and government for, organising that in such a way that we were able to have our conversation and our biffo in a respectful way.
Shout out to David Epstein and Louise Ryan from the Chifley Research Centre, who were basically the people that organised the whole Fringe program, which is not an easy thing to do, and I think it went off quite smoothly. It was a really good. I had a great time. I was joking from the Fringe back to the Fringe because I wasn't a delegate at the conference for the first time in a long, long time. In fact, I didn't even bother getting an observer's pass. I just sort of hadn't got my shit together, and the opportunity had passed itself. I couldn't actually physically get one, so I never saw anything off conference floor at all. And I spent the whole time just hanging out in the Fringe. And you're right, the security certainly felt greater than in previous conferences that I'd been to. However, I will say this: it's not as strict as the Labor Party conference in the UK, which they have every year. And if you've ever been to a Labor Party conference in the United Kingdom, and I really encourage folks to do so, that is massive. Now, it's not, the Democratic National Convention massive, but it is huge. And in fact, there is a ring of steel around the conference. And the conference everything happens within this sort of ring of steel, including the hotel that houses all of the delegates is inside this ring of steel. And so in order to pass through it, you've got to go through the equivalent of 2 layers of airport security. And I'm talking belts off, shoes off, through the X-ray radar thing. And you've got to walk through that. There are police officers with machine guns. The queues to get in are huge. There are choppers flying over the whole time. You don't bother leaving because it's a pain in the ass to get back in again to go through security. Do you know what I mean? So and it's massive. And when you walk into the conference area, the Fringe program happens sort of throughout the whole sort of inside this ring of steel. But there's also this big sort of market square where, like what happened at the Fringe here in Brisbane, where all the different sort of community organisations set up their stalls, and all the delegates have to walk through that in order to get to the conference. So there was a lovely connection between the conference and the Fringe program. Whereas one thing I did note here was there was a disconnect, and so some of the delegates who had to appear at came on the show for the podcast, the walk from the conference to the Fringe program actually is quite a long distance. They were getting up their steps by just transferring back and forth between the Fringe program and the conference. I was talking to David Epstein beforehand. He said they tried to do that, but they weren't keen. Well, whoever was sort of overseeing the whole program, they weren't keen to have that happen. I think that's a missed opportunity. It'd be great for those who are participating in the Fringe to be able to easily mingle with delegates and observers that are going to the conference as well. But anyway,
Yeah, that sort of brings some of that community life back to it, which I think it sort of historically had. Your talk of the British Labor Party's conference reminds me of when I was, I think I was like 19 years old or something. For some obscure reason, I got invited to George Bush Senior visiting Victoria, hosted by Joan Kerner. And I'm at this lunch. So I would tell people, of course, I'm just popping out to lunch with the President of the United States, and me and about 1,200 people. And I've never seen security like it in my life. Like I had this little, it was sort of very pre-tech days, of course, I had this little gold embossed invite. And the first people I had to get through were Victoria Police. And after that, it was 7 places I had to go through. And we didn't have airport security then. So the notion of these rather enormous looking Americans in their suits, I assume packing heat, that would put you through a scanner and then I've never come across this in my life, but it was extraordinary. And even when Bush got off the stage, the curtains opened and you suddenly realised that you weren't even allowed, an aeroplane, you couldn't have even seen in the building when he was there. So it was just completely at a level of security. And I wondered also, as you were speaking about the BLP, of course, they've got that history of the Troubles when there was, local terrorism. And so I guess the UK was been beefing up, and the US, of course, for a lot longer than we have. And we're tremendously peaceful in our political angst here, I guess, in comparison.
we are. I think depends on who you're referring to, but on this podcast, we probably call them freedom fighters, John. But anyway, we'll let that one go through. This is a Republican podcast after all. Okay, let's talk about the referendum. And we're going to do, just for the listeners, we're going to do a number of these episodes in the lead up to the actual vote. Now, as I said, we're recording this on a Tuesday, and there's reports that the date of the referendum will be announced this coming Thursday, but this episode gets released on a Friday. So if you're listening to it, it's already happened. And I guess probably one of the worst kept secrets in national politics is the date is most likely going to be held on the Saturday, the 14th of October, which actually is the same date as the New Zealand national elections as well. So we could be surprised and discover that isn't the date, but my own intel from talking to folks within parts of the campaign is that most likely will be the date, and doesn't seem like that's going to change. The last time you were on the show, I was going to say, yes. So we're bringing a whole bunch of people onto the podcast over the weeks leading up to the referendum, starting with your good self, John. I want to talk to you initially about the messaging. The last time you were on the show, you had yourself and Dr. Andrea Carson from La Trobe University on the podcast, and we were kind of talking about messaging and data and what we're seeing in terms of the campaign as it unfolded. That was a while ago now, and we're now 7 weeks out, most likely from an election date. Starting with the Yes campaign and their messaging, what has things changed? Have things improved? What are your reactions to what you've seen from the Yes campaign in terms of their central narrative?
Well, I should probably start off saying that, of course, I was very optimistic when we spoke earlier, and I'm now sort of hanging on to some threads of hope. And the thing about polls, you've got to be careful about polls, and I don't think people are super engaged in the issue, and that's they're not super engaged in elections. It's our job to get them engaged, so they're not super engaged in this. So it's still absolutely in the hunt in this, but I was much more optimistic. The Yes campaign, if I'm talking Yes 23, the people running their central message, and indeed, if you look at the Labor Party's sort of messaging guide for people, it's good and it's strong, and it's basically this: the message is it's threefold. I like one-fold messages, but it's threefold, and it goes that respect, and I think that is entirely appropriate. I'm absolutely certain that the vast majority of Australians want to show a respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a way that we sort of all recognise perhaps we haven't done very well as a collective nation in the past. The other part of the message is listen. And because that's essentially what the Voice proposition is, it's a listening proposition. And the other idea is about this bright future together, and essentially a reconciliation proposition. Those are good messages. They will all be, they're certainly testing well. When I was testing them some time ago, I'm sure they're still very strong. But I don't know that. It'll sound like I'm being a bit harsh too. The people running the campaign, I don't so much mean here Yes 23, because at this stage they're not yet active participants in this campaign. That'll sort of happen when the flag drops, right? Then they're spending their money on advertising and promotion. Leading up to it, it's really the federal government that is the advocate to date. And my definition of a coherent message is something that the public would clearly be able to understand and reflect back to you very well. So in that sense, I don't know that the public has received a coherent message yet. Not because there isn't a good coherent message there, it's just because it's been sort of struggling to get its momentum. Whereas I don't know that Dutton has got, and he's the leader of No, I don't know that Dutton's got a particularly coherent singular proposition of a message, but thematically it's pretty simple. It's the simple playbook to be about referendums, which is sort of risk, danger, not quite sure. And if you're going to put to the public that we've got to change the Constitution, and I don't argue the public's got an enormously strong understanding of what the Constitution is, but you'd sort of get, wouldn't you, that if you had to vote on it, it must be pretty important. And if it's pretty important, you'd want to be pretty clear about what it was, and you want it to be pretty safe. So I think it's a pretty easy space Dutton's had to pitch into. So now the transition as the flag drops, hopefully, the flag I think will be dropped by the time people are listening to this, got that 6 or 7 weeks, then we're going to want to see that real clarity of message. And people, look, as you know, many, many times in election campaigns, it takes a couple of weeks of the, for parliamentary elections for the public to tune in, and then they'll often say, I haven't taken much notice of it yet. So, look, that's the last opportunity, isn't it, as people actually start to engage. But I'd much rather have 5 points in front than behind at any election starting, but particularly a referendum. So, I'm certainly not giving up, but and absolutely got optimism that we've got the best argument, but difficult position to be in at the moment. Rather be 5 points better than we are, or 10 points better.
You've raised something there that I was going to ask later, but I'm going to ask it now. And you talked about, when the flag drops. I think you're using a Formula One analogy there, but and my question was going to be, there are two thoughts of what a campaign looks like in terms of timeline. There is those that think the campaign begins when, to use your term, the flag drops. When a prime minister goes and visits a governor general and says, can you please issue writs to dissolve the House of Representatives? And, the formal campaign begins. And historically, that's been a 33-day campaign. We used to always get these big, wall charts from NatSec, which was our 33-day campaign, and start doing your work from then on. And the media starts to pay attention. Oh, the campaign's begun, and they'll do mastheads, election, 23, and start to write about it as a campaign. And also in the minds of voters, oh, there's an election on, to your point. Oh, is there an election on? Right, okay, and start to pay attention. But there's also a view that a campaign begins when we say a campaign begins, when we start allocating resources. And that's up to you when you choose to do such a thing. And let's be honest, this campaign's now been going essentially since Anthony Albanese won the election and got up on election night and said there will be a voice to Parliament. Now, whether or not elements of the Yes side were ready for that, I don't know. And I guess in the review of this campaign, that should be actually looked at. But certainly over the summer break that we just had, that 2022 into 2023, I felt like this campaign began because it started to hit the front pages of the papers, and I think it was being generated by, in particular, the No, a coming together of those No forces. So this campaign's been in play now for the better part of 9 months, and you mentioned before about, you're wondering about, where is the momentum? Do you think the momentum has been with the Yes or with the No camp since the start of the year?
Well, it's hard to say the momentum's been with anything other than no. I mean, and there's a thing that's sort of happened in that time. And I reckon, in a sense, the campaign, there's two definitions, but the earlier definition of the campaign started really when Dutton said no, right? Because that then said that there's a contest of ideas. And so before that, you really just had this sort of drip feed of lots of different sporting and other types of community organisations all getting on the bandwagon and saying, well, this seems like a lovely idea, you know. And it was easy for them to get on the bandwagon. It's such a harmless thing to do. It's such a beautiful symbolic idea, the notion that we would listen to First Nations people. So it seemed a very safe thing to get on. But once Dutton came out and said that, then that flagged to people who aren't tremendously engaged. And look, generally people aren't that engaged in politics, and I used to find that frustrating. I've now realised they've got better things to do with their lives, you know, or other things, I should say. And so once that happened, there was a contest of ideas. And at the point that that happened, all he had to do was say, oh, I'm not sure. And he pretended he was unsure for some time.
And he was always going to say no. He was always voting no.
In fairness to him, and this is also in fairness to us strategically, we should have been aware of this too, assuming if we weren't, he had to say no. I spoke a minute ago saying that the overwhelming majority of Australians, I'm talking 75% or something, there's really positive attitude to First Nations people that, you know, it's really lovely and positive and probably didn't exist even 10 years beforehand, but it's there. And there's this genuinely strong desire for this sort of rapprochement, this coming together as a united nation and to sort of set aside the inequities and unfairness and, frankly, racism of the past. But 20 to 25% of people are still quite hostile to Aboriginal people, and they are overwhelmingly coalition supporters, and in particular those sort of orange branded ones, you know, those ones that might flip between Liberal, National and One Nation. I'm not talking those sort of ones that might flip between Liberal and Teal, for example. And Dutton had to shore up that base. He got a shocking spanking at the election, lost that moderate Teal vote, I shouldn't call it Teal, a moderate Liberal vote in big numbers, didn't lose that hard sort of orangey, so I say orange because it's Pauline Hanson's colour, sort of branded sort of coalition thinker and voter. And, he had to stick with his base there. He couldn't afford to be out of step with them. And they are still quite hostile towards Aboriginal people. So he was always going to say no. And then all he had to do was say, I'm not sure, raise questions about detail. As Ronald Reagan once said famously, when you're explaining, you're losing. You're a pretty simple guy. He understood simple proposition. And so he just had to just keep peppering him about what if. And didn't he release something like 97 questions, most of which were stupid that we already had clear answers to, but had a really clear strategy of just muddying the waters and creating doubt. And I think that therein lies our greatest opportunity. That's all he's been able to do, is muddy the waters and create doubt. There's not really a strong proposition for why it would be a bad thing to listen to Aboriginal people via a voice. So that there's not really a bad thing there yet that is a danger. There's just doubt and uncertainty and fear and friction that doesn't quite sort of add up. So that's what gives me some hope that if we can, fill up the answer with the positives we can get out of it, and we can really come down to a really simple proposition, which I think I espoused last time, which is simply that if we listen to Aboriginal people, we will make better laws about them. And it's just that simple idea. And if we can be running home with that message, then, and of course, listen itself undermines a lot of fear, doesn't it? When was listening ever dangerous? Not that I think we would be making that point, because then you're talking about relativities of danger. But I think that we do need to gather some. To get back to your point about does the campaign start when the flag drops? I have often spoken to people in focus groups and said, now that the election campaign is on, particularly with fixed dates these days, fixed terms, you might be, it's only 2 months, or years, whatever. You know what people tell me the election campaign's on? When the first ad they see on telly. And again, because people don't watch telly ads as much now, that might be a little bit different. But people are going to perceive that this vote is on when they're getting stuff in their letterboxes, when ads are coming up on their phones and TV screens and on the radio, and there's billboards everywhere. There's a little bit of that now. When that starts to be wall to wall, that's when the public will start to say, oh, okay, now I have to engage and think about that.
Oh, I want to talk about how we can turn that around in a moment, but I just want to sort of get your thoughts on more reflections to the point you just said there. the No campaign have spent 12 months or 8 months creating doubt and uncertainty. And if I was running a campaign from opposition, sorry, be clear on that, not opposing the referendum, but in a traditional political campaign, if you want to get into government, you need to spend 12 months shitting on the government. What is wrong with the world today that we live in? And just 12 months of that. That's how I would run a campaign. So causing a problem, right? Creating a problem. So people eventually go, oh, that's pretty shit. Yeah, you're right. I don't like the current existence that we're in and we need to fix that. Then spend 12 months leading into the poll saying, and this is how we're going to fix it. And I think one of the criticisms of the 2019 federal election, this is controversial, but there is a view that all of the solutions that the Labor Party took to the 2019 campaign are great pieces of civic or public policy, but they never made the argument about why they needed those solutions. They never actually went around saying the economy is stuffed. These are the problems in housing. These are the problems around jobs. These are the problems. Your world is in turmoil right now, and there is someone who's responsible, but we're not going to come up with any solutions just yet. And then you come in with the solutions like getting rid of negative gearing, all that kind of stuff. And people start to make sense. Oh, that's why we need to fix this. But they never did that. They just sort of said, we're just going to do this. Everyone's going, why are we doing this? What I think has happened in this particular campaign is in the 8 months leading up to where we are right now, there has been a messaging vacuum from the Yes campaign that's been all positive and light. You're right. All the footy clubs and all the sporting organisations and all the Qantas and all the big Australian companies have all jumped on board, and that's fantastic. But there actually hasn't been, or I've not seen a messaging or an argument to say that this is the plight of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters that they live through every single day. Because I think most Australians probably don't know someone who is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. And if you don't know them, then you don't know the experiences that they go through. The fact that, the incarceration rates are, over and above the average, that the health, the closing of the gap issues around health and education, and a myriad of other issues as well, that non-Aboriginal Australian voters, first of all, need to understand what is the life that they go through and the challenges that they face every single day. Because then you can come in and say, and here is this is not going to fix all the problems, but this is a start. That the voice represents a start for us to say to the leaders of that community, how the fuck are we going to fix this? So I just wonder have we missed our chance, or is there still time? Or would you do that in the first place, John? If you were running the messaging campaign, would you spend 12 months going out to the electorate and treating them and saying, hey, these are the challenges that Aboriginal people face, and you need to be aware of this before we go and actually come in with a solution?
Yeah, your structure's, of course, exactly right. The thing where I'd probably say that I'd be setting up a slightly different problem. I think Australians are actually well aware of the awful circumstances of Aboriginal people. In fact, it's been very suitable to the right to talk about that, right? So they want to talk about things like incarceration rates because you don't have high incarceration rates without committing crime. So we're now sort of setting up Aboriginal people as committing crimes. And same with drug and alcohol problems, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I suspect actually in the public psyche, the level of sort of social dysfunction and problems that you might relate to sort of, substance abuse and sort of bad behaviour, if you like, are probably, if anything, exaggerated. What's probably little understood is the level of sort of still quite proactive racism that happens. Just a little example to use the sort of crime area. If there are two kids that are caught shoplifting and one's black and one's white, the chances of the police attending when it's a black kid are higher, statistically higher. The chances of that kid being arrested are higher if they're black. The chances of that kid being charged are higher if they're black. The chances of that going to court are higher if they're black. The chances of them being incarcerated if they go. So for the same offence. So all of these structural things sit there. But to me, in a sense, I think the unfairness and the injustice, and indeed the sort of inherited injustice, because if I just reflect on my family, for example, there weren't too many educated people in my family tree, but my grandfather had, made some money out of business, and that sort of meant even though the family was poor and mum was a single parent, she could always ring her dad if we couldn't quite pay the bill. Now, how many Aboriginal people, I mean, he'd be over 100 years old now, how many Aboriginal people that are my age would have had a grandfather that was born in the over 100 years ago, could have been there to pay the bill if they got in a bit of strife, right? So I think people get all of that. I reckon the thing that the problem I would have wanted to create would have been this lack of consultation. So if you talk to white fellas, there's all these bodies and everyone's always talking to Aboriginal people, that's actually technically true. You go and talk to black fellas and they'll say, there's this endless consultation where nobody takes any notice of anything we say. And there's also this really consistent solution. When you, for example, if you want to improve the health outcomes for Aboriginal people in an Aboriginal community and you have an Aboriginal run and controlled, Aboriginal CEO, Aboriginal policymakers on the board, and predominantly, not always, but predominantly Aboriginal staff delivering the service, these things work. And when services are designed and provided by non-Aboriginal people, they just don't. And this is a pretty simple concept, isn't it? This notion, and if I were to just reflect that over now to country people, do you think if country people are noting their differences in sort of transport, etc., if they were to set up their footy team as opposed to some sort of boffin in the CBD setting up the structure of the way that they play footy and etc., would it work better if it was done by the locals? Everyone gets that idea. So what we've had in this country, that's the big problem I would have been setting up for a year, would have been Aboriginal people's voice isn't heard. And it's just not. A lot of time spent consulting, very little time, from an Aboriginal perspective, very little genuine consultation and very little conversion of that consultation into meaningful outcomes because of that, right? So that would have been the problem I would have set up, because that's the problem the voice is meant to fix. And I suspect that, if anything, the horrors of Aboriginal people's circumstance in this country are probably quite well understood.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energise the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. And to your point there, I've been privileged enough to, in my capacity with Dunn Street, worked with the First People's Assembly of Victoria for the last two and a half years. And part of the work we've been doing is working with their community organisers. These are black community organisers going in and organising Aboriginal Victorians and getting them to enrol to vote then for the Assembly members that will then now go negotiate a treaty with the Victorian State Government. Just a pretty significant bit of history happening in this state that isn't getting a lot of airtime while we're talking about this whole voice stuff. Just want to name that. But in one of the sessions where we're working on the community organisers' public narrative, in particular the story of self, and one of the organisers was talking about some of the challenges that they faced when they were young activists. And the question about, when did you decide that you want to take on a leadership role within your community? And they talked about growing up, a young kid in an Aboriginal household, and the love and respect they had for their elders and their relatives. There's always someone within the family that sort of takes on a leadership role, and they look to them and say, "Oh, that's someone I want to emulate or be like or do things when I become, a young adult." And this particular organizer went on to do that kind of work. And I said, well, when did you first sort of find a challenge in that kind of work? And they said, I can remember it vividly. I was working for one of the, Aboriginal community organisations in regional Victoria. And what she wanted to do was organise a weekly coffee for the Aboriginal women in that particular town. And that was it. just on a Monday morning for them to come together and bring their kids to this coffee shop and then just get them together and have a chat, have a yarn with each other. Pretty simple thing, right? And the public servant, or the white public servant, put the kibosh on that and said, yeah, don't know if we can do that for all of these different reasons. And the organizer was absolutely dumbstruck. Why can't we just do this? This is a good thing, right? We're trying to bring them into an environment where they can communicate and share experiences and build relationships. And it was a start. And it was her strategizing was, let's get these people together more often. And then from there, we can start to build trust and love with each other and then work towards how do we start to solve some of the problems in our own community. So even in that initial small idea of bringing people together, it got knocked on the head. And to your point, that's the kind of things that I think that you're right. That we could be lifting up and showing to the rest of the community, because most Australians would go, well, that was ridiculous. Of course they should be allowed to get and have a freaking coffee. Like, come on. What are we doing here? Anyway, to your point.
Yeah, and I that's a really interesting point as well. As one of the things I noticed in doing some focus groups with First Nations people was that it suddenly struck me that if you put to most other Australians, I'm probably more thinking white, sort of Anglo, sort of our sort of background here, Stephen. If you put an idea to someone, they'll process it and go sort of yes or no, and I have or haven't changed my view, or that makes me think differently, or you've persuaded me, or you haven't, or whatever. But when I would put these ideas to Aboriginal people, they would say things like, yeah, that's interesting. I want to go and talk to people about that. And what they meant was they wanted to go and talk to others in their family and community about it. And it wasn't until I sort of had gone through this a few times, and this was a consistent pattern, that I realised that this is a difference between collectivist decision-making and individual decision-making. And I thought, and then thinking, oh, Aboriginal people are different, aren't they? And then it suddenly struck me, no, it's actually us. Like, you look at Africans, Asians, South Americans, most people, First Nations people around the world, most cultures are actually collectivist community decision makers. We are the gods of individual choice in capitalism and in democracy. It's like your vote, your right to choose the product you buy. And we've really idealised this for probably a couple of 100 years. I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just noting it. And so then it's just a different way of decision making. So what that young woman understood very clearly about her community was that in order to make decisions, in order to move forward, we need to come together. And it was just like the obvious first step for her. That's not, and I still think that absolutely functions in our sort of more typical Anglo sort of communities as well. But it's so much more pronounced there. There's a classic example of just this really commonplace cultural difference that, one person understands and one person doesn't. And in a sense, that what you've just said is a beautiful story of, a great reason to vote for the Voice, isn't it? This notion of listening and having people with a different sort of perspective and a different cultural way of doing things being provided with this consistent avenue to provide advice about how to craft law and policy.
Well, I mean, if I was going to run the central message for another Scottish independent referendum, whenever that happens again, I would be saying, vote yes, because, the English have been stuffing it up for our lives are, Scotland can't get much worse than it is right now. And the English have been stuffing it up for 350 years. I'd much rather us be in charge and stuff it up than have a bunch of English people be in charge and stuff it up. And in some ways, I feel like with the referendum here in Australia, we've tried, the white person has tried to fix, or I mean, that sounds so patronising, but has sort of intervened into the affairs of Aboriginal people, and we've been stuffing it up for 230 years. Why can't we just let them, have a crack? And we're not even letting them have a crack. We're just saying we're going to create an advisory body that's no different to the advisory bodies that exist in so many different other departments within government, right? Like everyone's got an advisory body, but for some reason, for Peter Dutton and the Conservatives, we're drawing a line on this one. No, I can't have that. It's just, when you rationalise it, it's pathetic that right now we're on the, if a poll happens tomorrow, it's going to get down. It's going to get voted down. And I'm just, it's illogical. It just, my brain, I just can't compute that how the hell did we get to this place? This is insane.
I think structurally, and again, obviously a new government's got a lot on its plate, and perhaps that does say something about when you should have a referendum, when you're perhaps a bit more feet under the desk. But to his great credit, Albo understood that this was one of the central things that our nation needed to heal, right? Like it's 2022, I think he was elected, and the first thing he said when he stood up was, we're going to do something about this. And I think that was a great opportunity for change. But then he had to get his feet under the desk, and how many things must a new government have to do? I mean,
It's a startup.
it's an incredibly difficult sort of thing to do. But if you'd had your way, you'd have appointed your campaign manager within the first week. And a wonderful campaign manager has been appointed by Yes23, a guy called Adam Noble. He ran the plebiscite on marriage equality, really smart campaigner. But, I think he was appointed a couple of months ago. I mean, if he'd been appointed with a month out, a month out of the federal election, if you're going to make it the first thing on your speech on the night, you better get the agenda going. Also, in fairness to it, and I definitely had this problem for me too, just to sort of explain it a little bit. And I do want to move forward to the positive place about what we're going to do about this, but it's worth having a look at where we got here. I reckon in working for Aboriginal people on doing some research on this, there's a couple of points where I found myself thinking, it's not really my place to provide advice about how this should be run. This is a First Nations people's issue. And I'm so acutely aware that the voice is the manifestation of a self-determination idea. And if that language of self-determination isn't familiar to all of the listeners, self-determination is really the simple concept that each person or each community ought to be able to make decisions about their own selves and their own communities. A really beautiful idea. And this is probably the cornerstone of Aboriginal advocacy, First Nations advocacy in this country for some decades now, I think. It's the cornerstone idea. Let us make our own choices about our lives, having been robbed of choices for such a long time. So in that context then, as a white fella, I'm sort of acutely conscious that I'm this sort of middle-aged white bloke, I didn't want to sort of intervene. And then it was probably sort of 3/4 of the way through the project, I said, hang on, this is a job about how we persuade 97% of Australians that are not First Nations to vote for it. Sorry, this is my day job, right? And then I got a bit pushier about how to manage it. So I think probably took us a while to sort of come to that conclusion. So I think a whole lot of reasons why we got off to a slow start, but and it of course was easier for Dutton, and he is just playing a wrecking role. And if you have a look at where the polls are at the moment, sure, we're a bit behind, but you start to break this up. A classic partisan division. So very strong support from people under 35, very low support from people over 55, very strong support from Green and Labor voters, very, very weak support from coalition voters. And even the state breakdowns, you sort of see more that, where Victoria is the best and then sort of, Queensland, WA the worst. So you're really seeing a classic partisan divide, and that's because Dutton made it a partisan issue. And I think you were right earlier when you said we knew that was going to happen. We probably should have been prepared for that. In some ways, it's got some classic politics about it. I would just make a point here, though, for Dutton about this. I reckon the Teal seats are going to vote yes. Upper middle class white people who historically vote Liberal, who defected and voted Teal, are probably, if you look at the demographics of it, you get more educated, you're more likely to vote yes. These people are more inner city votes yes, right? These people are probably, so this is Dutton yet again reaffirming that the Liberal National Coalition is this coalition of people outside the big cities who don't really represent what is probably 2/3 to 3/4 of coalition voters, upper middle class white people in the big cities. So, those are not going to be the people that sink this thing. And so that's, and he's going to be, and I think there was also some polling, I can't speak to its accuracy, about, sort of losing some Labor working class voters in the periphery of the sort of outer suburbs. And that wouldn't surprise me either. That's sort of been the Liberal, since Howard really, been the Liberal strategy. Let's peel off those blue collar people that are disaffected by economic change and try and blame, whether it was Muslims or Aboriginal people or, migrants or something, refugees, try and find someone else to blame. A very sort of Trump-esque sort of strategy. And I think that Dutton is not going to heal the fundamental problem he has in trying to get a majority in the House of Representatives by this position he has taken.
You've started to wade into the data stuff, and I just want to bring a couple of bits of research to your attention, just for the reference. The Guardian online has produced a sample of all the published polls to this point, so an aggregated collection of data points going back to a YouGov poll study on the 19th of March this year, all the way through to the most recent one, which is a Resolve poll on the 13th of August. Things that jump out at me that worry me first, and then I'll go to the things that I think that give me hope, because I always want to end on a higher note. Yeah, you're right. 39 majority against, WA and Queensland 39 40 points. So sorry, those in favour of change, or those in favour of the yes vote in Queensland and WA, it's hovering around 39 40 points. New South Wales 41, South Australia 45, Victoria 47. So Victoria's underwater right now. If we go back to the last referendum we had, 1999, the Republic referendum, the polls leading into the date of the election, the date of the referendum, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia were ahead. They were 53, 54. And in the end, none of the states voted in favour of the yes campaign to become a republic. And what worries me is that even the state of Victoria is underwater. And I'm sort of thinking, because their strategy was, don't worry about, from what I'd heard from the yes campaign, don't worry about Victoria, don't worry about New South Wales, they're locked. It's the other states we want to, divert our resources into to make sure we get the 4 out of the 5. And right now it's underwater. And if we're to believe this aggregated surveys, and I will note that the surveys that are state level might be a bit underdone. So this data could be wrong. It could be 47, but it might be 51. But this would worry me as a campaigner, that we're not even winning in Victoria right now. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. 100%, but really that just speaks to being quite a bit behind. And the strategy is still sort of right, isn't it? That if you don't get Victoria and New South Wales, it's very difficult to get a majority across the country. Victoria and New South Wales between them are a sort of a quarter and a third respectively of the population, another fifth in Queensland. And Brisbane will do better than the rest of Queensland. So in a sense that you would disproportionately, because of the need to get majority in 4 states, that you disproportionately pick out the 2 smaller states of South Australia and Tasmania, and that you would hope that the centre of gravity in our country really is Melbourne and Sydney. And of course, greater Melbourne and greater Sydney, and in some ways, Victoria being a relatively small state, greater Melbourne almost includes the whole state, really. But if you start to include I'm sorry, getting too much into the minor geography of it. But so I think that strategy is still sort of valid, that you're going to have to run a decent campaign in New South Wales and Victoria, but you might proportionately not necessarily overspend there. You definitely overspend in South Australia and Tassie, because you can buy every billboard in Tasmania and South Australia for 5% of what a half decent campaign goes elsewhere. The other call would be whether you'd spend anything much in WA and Queensland. You have to think there's worth campaigning in Brisbane. There's a lot of people there. You want to make sure you've got a majority across the country, but it'd be tempting to not put too much effort in there and really just have the 4 states that you'd put most of your campaign in. But, a bit of a sad day to think that a proposition that really should be about unifying our nation, it would be great to win every state and territory. And look, the polling I was doing in January, we were in front in Queensland, and I still thought we'd probably win Queensland at that point. And that was even when I was taken off 5 points, because you think you're going to probably lose. You're probably going to go backwards, once the campaign gets going. Not so much because I think you generically go backwards, but I think when you're a long way in front, you usually come back a bit. I thought that was reasonable. So I don't necessarily think I mind the strategy, but you're right. If we can't win Victoria, there is no possibility of winning. We would want to see Victoria about 60-40 would be the yardstick to say you'd start to get confident that you'd get 55 in New South Wales, and then you ended up 51 across the country, and hope you get 51 or 2 in South Australia and Tasmania. But very sad to think that we're talking about slim, even in that scenario, Stephen, we're talking about slim majorities. this really should have been something that, could have had overwhelming support, a bit like the marriage equality plebiscite.
Yeah, and I think it's unfair on the marriage equality plebiscite, and it's unfair on the referendum to compare them, because the marriage equality survey was non-compulsory. And I reckon if that was compulsory and a referendum, I think that the result would have been maybe the same, but damn, it would have been a lot closer. And I just think there was a lot of people that didn't vote, which makes me think that maybe, I'd be those folks listening out there talking to your grannies or whatever that might be a little bit, going the other way and voting no. I'd say if you don't know, don't go. Like, maybe there needs to be some sort of voter suppression in this campaign just to sort of make sure there's a whole bunch of, redneck racists don't turn up to vote.
Well, there's also the difference with them. You're right. There's no perfect comparison, but probably referendum, sort of republic was probably a better comparison. But the marriage equality thing also wasn't opposed by the Liberal Party. The thing about the Liberal Party is that there might not be too many Aboriginal people actively involved in the party, but the nature of sexuality is such that they, being of a right wing disposition doesn't make you any more or less likely to be straight or gay. So, it was very difficult for the Liberals to come out and be hard opposed, although, of course, the likes of Dutton and Morrison were, and Abbott, but the machine itself wasn't universally against, and indeed it went ahead under a relatively progressive Liberal Prime Minister. So that was a bit different. Look, I think we could probably spend a bit of time, and this is perhaps one of the things you do when you think you've lost, isn't it? Go over the reasons why you're behind, and perhaps that's a reflection on our pessimism. But I still, this is a campaign to be won and is within the realms of winnability, and I think we should still be getting out there working our guts out.
Oh no, absolutely. To be fair, I guess what I'm trying to do is, in some respects, is generate a bit of urgency amongst our people to get out there and actually do something, because otherwise it is, we're in trouble. So, if you haven't, and I'll say this at the end as well, if you haven't done anything, get involved in the campaign, go knock doors, go make calls. Like, this is the only way we're going to turn this around. We'll leave the rest of the campaign to do the sort of the broadcast messaging and final, couple of 7 weeks of the campaign. Okay, one more thing that I took from the recent research that I was surprised by: 58% of Labor voters are supporting yes. I thought that number would be higher, and the Greens at 70%. I thought that number would be higher as well. And I'm wondering what needs to be done within those two cohorts to shift that a bit, given that, over the last bunch of elections, state and federal, the Labor vote has been the most dominant vote, right? So let's make sure this low-hanging fruit. Now, I'll look at the campaigns from that perspective. Let's get this low-hanging fruit out for us first of all, and then move to the soft votes, right? So there's clearly a lot of soft votes within the Labor community, Labor voting community. We need to lock in. I'm just surprised. Are you surprised by 58 for Labor?
Oh, well, sort of, but only if you move the line in the middle. So what you've sort of got, you've got 58 Labor, which of course we'd like to see high, but Coalition's 25, right? So, it's just that when the middle's off, then it sort of drags everybody. And I think most of these things we're seeing in this stuff is a classic reflection of a sort of a partisan sort of left-right contest, really. And so if we were not on whatever the latest thing is on, what are we on overall? I suppose if you're about sort of 45, if we're on 55, then we'd be talking having a third of Coalition people and 2/3 of Labor people. It'd be, or better, it'd be looking a bit more like that. So in that sense, however, it is a very good point that as a really simple and in many ways beautiful proposition, that if we haven't been able to convince our team, look, I mean, to me, the whole, I think I've said this to you before. I think it's why your operation is so important, is that we will probably one day reflect on a golden era of political campaigning when you could buy ads on television and persuade people. And leading up to that point, you had to go and knock on doors and shake hands and meet people and persuade them and talk to them and win them over. And that day has already returned to a significant degree, not entirely, but the capacity to just buy decisions from big ad spends is in sharp decline and will continue to. And this notion of community organising is back where we're going. And so, but that only works when ordinary people that aren't members of parties probably would never think about being a member of a party, but would absolutely sign themselves up to being, I'm a Labor voter, and they'll just introduce themselves like that. I'll have people talk about this in focus groups. Well, I'm a Labor voter, or I'm a Labor voter, so, they just sort of, they identify, and it's probably only about a third that on each side that sort of identify as partisan in that way, and others probably slightly less identify or identify as swinging or whatever. But those people need a really beautifully simple message. And I don't mean simple because it's a dumbass thing. That's not what I mean by simplicity. Simplicity to me means, I describe it as beautiful simplicity. It's a simple idea that can encapsulate the values proposition that we've got, a simple idea that can reject the opposing proposition. So when I say simple, it's something you work incredibly hard on over a long period of time to come up with this beautiful, simple idea. And we've got to get that out to people. And so I guess reaching out via your audience, that simple proposition I would be talking about. And it's not drifting away from where Yes Campaign is on that respect, listen, and a beautiful future together. But I think that if you simplify that down a bit to just listen, there is no listening without respect, right? Can you disrespectfully listen to someone? It's an oxymoron the way it's a sort of its syntax doesn't quite match. So just the concept of listening is a respectful idea. Do you think it's time that we listened a bit more to Aboriginal people? That's pretty hard to reject, isn't it? I mean, then you're putting Dutton into this spot where he's got to say, I stand against listening. I mean, that would be such a difficult thing to rebut. The listening can't cause any harm. And so I think it's inherently respectful. So I think that whilst respect is important, I think I'd probably put respect into the tone here rather than into the front of the message. And I think even that sort of notion of this notion of coming together and this beautiful cooperative future together where as one people, we now have sort of healed the divisions and injustices of the past. I don't think, listen would be a first step towards that, wouldn't it? I mean, imagine you're thinking about two parties that have been at war for some time or have had terrible conflicts. Getting above my level of knowledge if it's outside Australia, but if you're thinking about, the Ireland Great Britain contest that sort of, I think, is largely sort of resolved with some desires for a bit more republicanism in the north by some, or if you think about what we hope might one day happen in Israel and Palestine, where would you start towards that rapprochement? You would start with listening. So to me, this simple, I've been rambling on forever to get to a simple proposition. By listening to Aboriginal people, we can make better laws and policies to improve the quality of their lives. And I really think the vast majority of Australians really do want Aboriginal people to have a better quality of life and do recognise that that is really the central thing that we need to do something about. So that can sort of hook into that broader problem that you were talking about, and I think it can cover them all. So, if you're knocking on a door, and the question I would like to be in people's heads when they walk into that ballot box, assuming we're going to physically walk into a ballot box, not quite sure how the mechanics of that are, if that's decided, but, you'd want to be thinking, will listening to Aboriginal people lead to better decisions and better laws and better policies? And I think that'd be very easy to answer, yes, it probably would. Or even just a simpler, should we listen to Aboriginal people before we make laws and policies about them? And I think that is such a beautifully simple proposition. It's easy for everyone to understand. It's got values. It's hard to reject. It rejects the no proposition. It's got that sort of common sense logic about it too. That sort of just obviously sort of makes sense. And you can then use those parallels about, if you were designing a building and you wanted to have access for people with disabilities, would you talk to people with disabilities first? Well, of course you would. And so whether it was disability, whether it was country people, whether it was old people, whether it was migrants, whether it was young people, whoever that group was, whether it was women, whoever it was that you were seeking to make policies about and for, you would obviously listen to them first. And I think this sucks out the fear thing that's running around, as well as making it a beautiful and simple, logical and moral idea.
Two areas of hope as well that I want to go to off the back of that, those points you just made there, John. One is the AEC in June released data about new enrolments, and it all points to I think anyway, you can extrapolate from it that there is good data coming through. The estimated youth enrolment rate between 18 to 24-year-olds is now at 90.3%, and it's up from 87.6 in 2022. I think that's a substantial jump.
Very big jump.
Across
Yeah. Very hard to get from 90 to, from those high numbers to other high
first
numbers.
time, the first time since they've been tracking this, it's ever been above that 90% threshold, which is huge. And all other data as well all indicates that there is a huge uptake of enrolments, which I think is I'd like to draw from that as a positive sign for the Yes campaign. More people on the ballot that are going to vote yes and turn out to vote in a compulsory referendum has got to be a positive thing. The second thing I find interesting is that notwithstanding that the yes vote has shed around about 20 percentage points in the last 12 months, I'm wondering about and I know that a lot of these researchers are trying to balance out the fact that they're probably not getting in a lot of the sample sizes of younger voters is going to be smaller because they simply aren't answering the telephone or aren't answering the door, or just the natural research challenges you have with that. I wonder if that cohort of voter, which is more than likely going to vote yes, and they're pegging that already at around 65 to 70%, if that's undersampled. And if it is undersampled, then maybe a lot of our polling, and that is right across the country, not just in the stronger states like New South Wales and Victoria, but across the country, that cohort of voter is undersampled, and therefore we're not getting a true, accurate reflection of where the electorate is right now, even before we then begin to drop the flag and start to campaign in a more traditional pre-2010 sense. And I just want to I look at those two things and say, yeah, this isn't done. This race isn't over, and it can be turned around.
Yeah, those things you're probably right about those things. Most of those pollsters, if they are concerned that they're underdoing young people, will probably be weighting them up a little bit. And the problem you can get there if your sample size is a bit small is, your weighting's just likely to damage your poll as much as your underrepresentation, because you haven't got enough people to weight up, essentially. But if you do the math on those things, they don't make enough difference to get us from 45 to 51. But if we're on 49, it could well be the thing that gets you over the line. But I mean, and this is typically the pattern you're going to see. If I couldn't ask someone's vote, but I could ask some other questions, first question I'd ask you is age. And if you're under 35, if I had no other data, I'd probably put you in a Labor Green camp or in a Liberal National One Nation camp if you're over 55, and so on. And the second thing you'd ask is probably location. And probably the bad news for us there is I'm not sure that we do a great job sometimes of sampling in more remote areas, and they're probably not the best for us, notwithstanding there might be more Aboriginal people there.
But not a lot of them, though, John. I mean, most of our voters live in our cities.
Absolutely. Yep, that's right. So, but I think that you're right to have a bit of hope that we might be a bit better than the polling there. But really what you got to get... You don't want to be worried about the numbers on the polls, do you? You've really got to get back to focusing on your clarity of message. And if you're miles behind, like I always reckon any poll in a general election between 50 and 52 and 48, that's just telling me to work harder, right? And I really think there's only three types, and I think you could put referendums in this case too, probably, notwithstanding we haven't got a huge amount of data to base this on. Generally speaking, three categories that you're looking at polling in. Consistently, you're above 54 or below 46. If that's consistent, then you're running a losing campaign in which you are just desperately shoring up your base to make sure that you don't lose too badly. If you're on 54, you leave your base alone and you get after trying to get more and more of that soft Liberal and really just try and monster them in that those other parts. Every other election, almost between 53.9 and 46.1, is just work your guts out in the middle. That's what it's all about. You don't change a strategic proposition, but you can have a slightly different proposition. For example, if you were miles in front, you might be running a bit of a campaign that said, look, you might be a Liberal, but, this time, these Liberals, just not quite this time, right? So you shift position a little bit. So at the moment, and the thing about this is there is no shoring up of seats. It's not that there's 150 seats in the House and we don't want the Libs to get 95. I mean, someone's going to get 76 and someone's going to get 74 and it's winner takes all, right? So in a sense, there is no strategy here to not lose too badly. You've got to get over the line in the middle and you've got to win. And so in that sense, it's a little bit difficult. I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that it's a higher threshold because you've got to get 4 states and a majority overall, because that's not much different to the vagaries of having to win a bunch of marginal seats or whatever anyway. So I don't think that's that much harder. If we get comfortably over a majority, we will probably win. If we probably won't get 51 across the country and not get 4 states, although that's possible. You get 52 or 53, it just gets mathematically unlikely that you wouldn't win 4 states.
To the point that you spoke there as well, and that was the second point I was going to say, and I can't remember, I saw some research a while ago, but I managed not to sort of drag it up for today's show, but the soft vote is huge. There are a lot of people that are not engaged in this right now. I think most people think The Voice is some TV show on Channel 10 where people get up and sing songs, right? So like, we've got an opportunity there through our campaign treatment, not just through direct voter contact on phones and doors, but also through social media, through earned media and through paid advertising to treat that soft vote and lock them in. And that soft vote clearly is both soft Labor vote and soft votes on all of those other categories. And I know that we don't have to look at it through the perspective of a Labor voter, a Liberal voter, or a Green voter, or another, or whatever, right? We should just sort of reset it and say either you're either hard yes or hard no, or soft yes
Absolutely,
or soft no,
100%.
right? So, but those two cohorts, that soft yes, soft no, are the group that we need to be going after, that are either likely undecided or likely persuadable, and they're the people we need to bring onto our pile. And the fact that it is so big tells me that there is still plenty of opportunity for the yes camp to win this thing.
And it completely makes sense, right, that soft vote would be big. And I think you're dead right there. That is the great hope out here, is there's an ideas contest yet to be had. And it makes sense that soft vote is big, because the no camp has really just been, not sure, doubt, risk, danger, not this particular voice. They even had a position of, we support state voices and regional voices, but not the national one. It's a weird proposition, quite effective in terms of a referendum where, I've got to make this what feels like a big change and I'm not quite sure. I need to have clarity of proposition. And then we haven't, as a yes campaign, or I should probably say, I don't think the Yes campaign's really been doing much at all, really. If you're talking about the actual committee that is Yes 23, really the federal government's been the proxy Yes campaign. And there probably hasn't been this sort of wonderfully coherent, simple, moral proposition that's been sitting there to make it clear for people. And people don't engage that much. So even if I don't engage much in politics, but, my mum and dad and my brother and sister are Labor or Liberal or whatever, I probably know how I'm going to vote. I mean, this is just a completely obscure thing to tons of people that they just don't know quite what it is. So it would make perfect sense that a significant number of people, easily enough to flip this from yes to no and back again, would be still awaiting clarity about what the values propositions are from either side. And I think that point, that values propositions, is so important here. Things like I don't understand the detail are never questions that I get asked about a proposition that I'm testing in research when there is a clear moral backbone to this idea. I think I've told you and others the story once of an ad I had to test, and it never went where or whatever, but it was an epiphany moment for me. It was way back in South Australia, Mike Rand's days. Mike Rand, of course, being very successful South Australian Prime Minister, and Premier, and a wonderful brand. Just seemed like the sort of bloke who'd stick up for the little guy, which was, I felt like when people said that, could I leave this group and get the early flight home because you win those elections out. I digress talking about Mike Rand like that. But I was asked to come up with a 15-second script as to why we should for an ad that was about putting 200 more nurses into public hospitals. And it seemed like such a good idea that we wouldn't need to waste a whole 30 seconds of television ad, which counted for a lot back in 2006, on this proposition. And of course, as soon as I put that to people, people said to me, yeah, but like, how many nurses are there? Like, is that like a few percent increase, or is it like out of 10,000 or out of 1,000? Is it a lot or a little bit? Yeah, but like over the 4 years, like, is that going to take into account those that resign and retire, or is that just like
Oh,
filling
God.
natural
I would
attrition?
hate that
It doesn't
person in the
matter.
room. I
What's
said I
that?
would hate that person in the room. I go, "Oh, can you leave? Can you leave, please? Just go."
But no matter what I did, if I was talking about numbers, it just kept coming back to doubting the number. Because here's a political party at an election putting numerical proposition to me. What's the one thing you know? They're probably bullshitting, right? So I couldn't get anywhere. So I was very embarrassed because I was promised I'd come up with a beautiful script. And overnight in the hotel room, I sort of woke up in the middle of the night and realised the problem. So the next day I had to invent a little white lie, which was that I got this recording of Mike Rann, but the recording's not very good, so I'll just read you the script. And of course, I made the whole thing up. And I read the script thus. This is Mike Rann. I understand that the caring touch of a midwife is worth more than her weight in gold to a first-time expecting mum. And any parent can tell you the relief they feel when a triage nurse tells you a little girl's going to be okay. And I think we all know that having dignity in our last days gets down to the quality of personal care that nurses, aged care nurses, provide us. And that's why I'm going to put 200 more nurses into public hospitals right across the state. Now, of course, that adds up to more than 30 seconds, but you could do each of those three intros on a little 15er. And when I read that whole thing out like that, you know what I got? Good on him. It's about time someone did something about that. Because this guy, mythical as it turns out, this mythical version that I invented of Mike Rann understood the proposition of a nurse, that care proposition. And if he's a premier of the state and he understands that proposition, he's going to get the number right, surely, okay? So this is what it suddenly dawned on me, that the currency of politics is not numbers, it's values, right? So what is the core values proposition that you've got? And at the moment, we've sort of got, actually, there is a beautiful values proposition by the Yes campaign. We just haven't been able to land the clarity on that and the simplicity of message yet. And it sits there with that respect, listen, and beautiful future together ideas, a strong values proposition. The Libs have got this sort of fear and danger idea that is sort of sitting there. But neither has that got a great deal of clarity. So when there is a clear values proposition, that is our opportunity to win that centre and, flip that 45 to a 55. That's going to be, if we get that right. And sorry, just one more thing, if I'm trying to pick the outcome of an election, not so much when the polls are dead cert, anyone can pick them. When they're tight and I'm get the chance to, and I've got a focus group, and I can ask this question and about the Monday or Tuesday before the election. I got the beautiful opportunity of doing this in Western Australia when that just Mark McGowan won the biggest result that anyone will ever win in the history of our democracy, probably. And I was able to say, look, I'm from Victoria, right? So I've really been following this campaign, but so what's Labor saying? What's it all about? And people said, Mark McGowan's strong, it was basically how you'd sum up the thing. What was our slogan? It was like, it was Mark McGowan and a strong something. I forget what it was there, but essentially people were parroting not just the tonal proposition of the campaign, but virtually the slogan. And then I said, okay, so what have the Liberals been saying? Oh, vote for us because we're going to lose, because as a leader, I make a terrible gaffe if I know I'm going to lose. And so it's like, you just know you're going to win then. So what I want to have happen is the Monday before this referendum, and you say, what's Yes saying? Well, Yes is saying that, we could probably improve Aboriginal people's lives if we listen to them more. And what's No saying? Well, that it's a bit too risky to listen. No will do better than that. But if the key point is our one, it's the only one we can really control. If people are saying that, then I'll be saying the polls, we're going to defy the polls. And it's usually when there's that sort of disconnect, and that's when you go, I think something different to what I expected is going to happen.
I want to end on a positive note, and that's a positive note for me. That's good enough for me, John Armitage. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really do appreciate it. As always, your insights into this historic and incredibly important referendum in our country. And just to remind people, it is not easy to win a referendum. Only 8 of them have got up. out of 44 or 45 or whatever it is. It's a ridiculous number. So these things are not easily won, but it takes people. And so we really encourage everyone out there listening to make sure you get out there. If you haven't enrolled to vote, enroll to vote. If you've got family members that haven't enrolled to vote, get them to enroll to vote. And if you haven't volunteered, then get on down. I think literally just type in Yes23 on your phone or on your web browser, and there's ways in which you can register your support. And then I think someone will get involved or get in touch with you. And I also know the Labor Party is very much getting far more involved in this campaign as well at your state branch level. So contact your own state branch, and they will be able to direct you to phone banks and door knocks that are happening throughout the weeks leading up to what we assume will be the 14th of October. John Armitage, once again, thanks for coming on the show.
Absolute pleasure, and look forward to coming back again.
Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Today's episode of Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians, and they've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means that you'll get the best results possible. To find out more, go to their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.